One of the most basic things that we do as property managers is collect the rent, and yet it generates a lot of questions. Four of them in particular. The first being, how much of a grace period should I give? In our opinion, none. Rent should be due on the day that you say it is, which is typically the first, unless you're required by some local ordinance or law or something like that, a weekend or a holiday to change that. Otherwise, it should be due on the first and late on the second. Second question people have is, how much should I charge as a late fee when a tenant pays late? And there's really no black or white law about this. We tend to see that 2 to 5% is acceptable and fair, and it's meant to compensate you for the additional work that you have to do in chasing that rent, which you otherwise shouldn't have had to do. But you can't do unreasonable things like charge a daily amount or an extremely high amount. So we recommend somewhere between 2 and 5%, but always dependent upon whatever the local law allows you to charge. The third question that people have is, what steps should I take when the first comes and goes and the rent still hasn't been paid? And we recommend taking several steps in order. The first being, open the lines of communication. You want to have a conversation with the tenant. Hey, what happened? Did you forget? Sometimes that's the case. They just forgot, believe it or not. Or maybe there's something that happened that they didn't tell you about. It is concerning if they don't pay and they don't talk to you. So you probably want to bring that up in the conversation as well, saying, hey, when you're not able to pay, you do need to give us a heads up so that we know what's going on. But just opening those lines of communication is a very important first step without getting too reactive, jumping to things too quickly. Just try to have a conversation about it first. Secondly, see if you can negotiate some form of a partial payment. That doesn't mean you're going to forgive any amount of the rent due, but oftentimes a tenant will say something like, I had some kind of a financial interruption. I'm not able to pay until the middle of the month. And the question that we will always ask in return is, can you pay some of it today? Could you pay half of the rent today? It's always good to get them to give something and not just let them off the hook with a, that's fine, 2 weeks from now is okay. And you also want to make it very clear when the second half of that rent is going to be paid and make sure that you're comfortable with when that is. This is all assuming that all of the rent will be paid within the month that it's due, meaning we're not going to allow, let's say it's April 1st, any agreements to partial payments that extend past April 30th. We want everything to be paid in the month that it's due. You also want to make sure that you get that, what we would call a promise to pay, in writing. You don't just want to take it verbally. You want to make the tenant give that to you in writing. There's a little bit of an effect that has by them having to put it into an email or a text message and tell you that they're going to do it. That increases the likelihood that they actually will follow through and do what they say they're going to do. So get it in writing. And finally, be ready and willing to enforce that promise to pay. Meaning, if you have those initial conversations, if you come up with a mutually agreeable plan on how you're going to pay the rent, that then if they don't meet that, you're ready to take action, which is legal action, in our case, filing of what is called an unlawful detainer or an eviction. And that would be the fourth question that people have, which is, when do I file an eviction? And it's essentially a very simple answer. If the promise to pay is not met, the one that you got in writing in the last step, that's the point where you now show the tenant you're serious and you file that eviction. And it's important to note that people's circumstances change all the time. Bad things happen to good tenants, which cause what was once a good on-time paying tenant to suddenly start paying late. And you can try to understand that, but ultimately, in our experience, once a tenant starts paying late, and once they don't communicate, and once they make promise to pays and they don't keep them, that is typically never a ship that turns around. And so your best bet in that case is to just go through the legal methods that you have to enforce your lease agreement and file the unlawful detainer and go to the court in order to recover both possession of your property and a judgment for the money that is owed to you for any missed rent payments. So all that to say, a strong rental collection process is really what helps enable you to own rental property without it owning you. And it doesn't mean you remove all compassion, all empathy from the equation. You can still have those lines of communication open like we talked about at the beginning of the video, and be empathetic and be compassionate, and yet still be firm and enforce the terms of your lease. One of the biggest mistakes that we see self-managing landlords make is they just drag this process on and on and on. They don't hold the tenant to their word. They allow unpaid rent to carry over into next month's, like, oh, I'll pay what I owe for last month, this coming month, or 2 months ago, in a month from now. That's almost always a bad scenario. If the tenant is not able to pay the rent in the month that it's due, what makes them think or you think that they're suddenly going to come into more funds in future months to both pay that month, which they've already shown that they struggle to pay, and prior months that they owe. So the biggest recommendation that we can give you is enter that conversation with compassion, but be ready to firmly and fairly enforce your lease. Be flexible and come up with agreements on when money will be paid if it is in fact overdue. But once it is missed, once the promise to pay is not paid, once the tenant does not live up to their word, then it's time to enforce your lease through the eviction process. And now this all sounds like not fun, something that you don't want to do. Nobody wants to have to negotiate promise to pays and file evictions and go through all that stress. And so the main thing that you can do as a landlord to protect yourself from this is to have a strong screening process. You need to be on defense to prevent these types of issues before they become problems. And the way that you do that is you have strong objective criteria on who you will rent to and who you will not, that's in compliance with fair housing and all the laws that it needs to be, but that holds people to standard and that catches fraud and misrepresentation and exaggerated landlord history and all of that on the front end, so that you have the best possible chance of placing a tenant in the home who's going to pay rent on time and not make you chase them. And that's so that you can own rental property without it owning you. That's what we do here at Mesa. And if you're interested in how our tenant screening process works, we have videos and a page on that that will go into that in more detail.